Okay, here we go. We're going to factor by grouping. And so far we have factored out the GCF, right? And so when we look at this, the greatest common factor, we're like, oh, we're not going to be able to do that, are we? So let's pick a pretty color. So basically, oh gosh, turquoise looks good. So basically, there's nothing, right? There's nothing that's going to go into 5, 25, 2, and 10. There's no number besides 1, right? And that's really a problem. And so that's why we're going to factor by grouping. We're going to go ahead and group 2 of these at a time. And so what we're going to do, let's go ahead and get a triangle going, or sorry, rectangle going, and let's cover up this second part, right? Let's go ahead, let's even shift it and cover it up this way. Now, can we factor the GCF out of here? We sure can, right? We can go ahead and just look at this part and say, well, I know 5 goes into both 5 and 25, so I'm going to take out a 5. And of course, as we talked about taking out the GCF when we're dealing with variables, if I have x to the third power, x to the second power, I can only factor out the one that's smaller, so x squared, right? Because once again, as we talked about, when we factor out a GCF, it's the opposite of when we distribute. So when we distribute, we multiply. When we factor out, we divide. So you could either use, like we did last video, you could either say, okay, 5x cubed divided by what we're taking out, 5x squared, leaves us with what? Just a plain old x. Or you could play the game that says, hey, what should I put here so that this times this gets me back to that, right? Either way, so we know that we have an x there, and then we do the same thing where we've got the 25x squared. You can use either method, right? You can take the 25x squared and divide it by what we're factoring out, right? And we know the x squareds cancel out, and 25 divided by 5 is 5. So we're good, right? We've done this. We're good. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and ignore this part. Oops, if our turquoise is going to pop through. And let's pick a different color, and we are going to look at the second part. Okay, so this is, we're grouping. We looked at the first 2, we grouped them together, we factored, and we're going to now group the second 2 and factor. And so when we look at the second 2, we're like, okay, what can I factor out of a 2x and a 10? Well, the only thing that I can factor out is just that 2, right? So I'm going to factor out a 2. Now, here's where people get into trouble. Am I factoring out a positive 2 or a negative 2? So I'm factoring out a positive 2, right? And so normally we just write 2. But because we're connecting with this part over here, this part over here, we need to have something in between. I just can't have nothing there, right? So we're going to go ahead and make sure we put a plus here. All right, so here we go. We're going to factor out 2x divided by 2 is an x, right? And that makes sense. 2 times x is back to 2x. And then, of course, 10 divided by 2 is 5, and that makes sense. 2 times 5 gets us back to 10. All right, so now what we've done is we factored by grouping, and it looks interesting, right? We kind of noticed something. It's like, okay, first of all, the cool thing is we went from, let me get some eraser going here. We went from 4, we went from 4 terms, right? That's a term, that's a term, that's a term, and that's a term. Terms are separated by either addition or subtraction signs, right? We went from 4 terms to all of a sudden, this is one term. I know what you're going to say. You're going to be like, Miss Overby, there is a plus there. But see, 5x squared is being multiplied by x plus 5, and x plus 5 is together. So just trust me here, okay? That's one term. There's my plus, and here's the second term. All right. Looking at these 2 terms, we're like, wait a minute. They both have something in common, don't they? So let's go ahead and use our rectangle again, and let's just do some really bright, some lime color, and let's put it around what we have in common. In the first term, we have an x plus 5. In the second term, we also have an x plus 5. So when we have something in common, when our terms have something in common, guess what we're allowed to do? we can factor it out. So let me make room to factor it out. Let me erase this stuff over here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to factor out. Let's go back to, we got so many colors going on here. Let's do pink. So we're going to factor out the x plus 5. All right, so now remember, we have two terms. This is a term, and this is a term. And so within those two terms, now we have the GCF of x plus 5. Now, this factoring is kind of fun because I can see if I factor out an x plus 5 from this term, well, it's just going to all go away, right? All goes away. And what's left? 5x squared. And if you want to distribute, you'll get the same thing going backwards. Now I'm going to move on to the second term. If I factor out an x plus 5, that means I'm dividing by x plus 5. That goes away, and I'm just left with a 2. So guess what? We're done. This is our answer. So it's really using factoring out the GCF twice. And the second time we do it, it looks a little funny, doesn't it? All right, let's do one more of these because they're not easy, and I think it'll be helpful if we just do that. All right, so here we go. Let's do it again. So we're going to group. We're going to group this one first, and then we're going to group that one second. And so here we go. When I look at the 3x cubed, well, here, I'll write it down. The 3x cubed plus 4x squared. Well, I look at the 3 and the 4, and it's like, I can't factor anything out of that because nothing besides 1 goes into 3 and 4. But when I looked at the x cubed and the x squared, I remember, oh, I can factor out that x squared. Now, I can't factor out an x cubed, right? Because, I'm saying x to the third is x cubed and x to the second, that's x squared. I always have to factor out my lower ones. I'm going to factor out my x squared, and what do I have left? On the side, if you want to do your division, you can. So we'd have a 3, right? And then we know 3 minus 2, right? When we divide with our same basis, 3 minus 2 is 1. So you could put x to the 1, or you could just put an x. And then I'm going to do the same thing. 4x squared divided by what I'm factoring out. I'm going to be left with a 4. All right, so I'm done factoring my first group. I'm going to go ahead and factor my second group. So with my second group, I'm going to write that down. And I'm going to look at my numbers. What goes into 6 and 8? 2 goes into both of them, right? So I'm going to factor out my 2. And is it a positive 2 or a negative 2? It's a positive 2. I have to put that plus in between. All right, so what's left? If I do this to the side, 6x divided by 2 gives me a 3x. And of course, 8 divided by 2 gives me a 4, and that's positive 4. All right, so we factored out the GCF twice, and now we realize, okay, we got to do it again. Because here's a term. We went from 4 terms to just 2 terms. And what do we see that both of them have? They both have the 3x plus 4, right? They both have that 3x plus 4. So when 2 terms have the same thing, we can factor that out. So we're going to go ahead and factor out the 3x plus 4. And so what's left? Now, I didn't do the division last time, so I'm going to do that to the side, or I'll do it below. So look, when I factor out a 3x plus 4, all right, I'm going to take this whole term, x squared, 3x plus 4, and I'm taking out 3x plus 4, right? I'm taking out, I'll put that in parentheses so it's more obvious. So I'm going to divide by 3x plus 4. Do you see when I do that? Bam, that cancels out with that, and all I'm left with is an x squared, right? Now I'm going to do the same thing with this term. I see that I have 2 times 3x plus 4, right? I'm going to divide by 3x plus 4, and when I do that, bam, they cancel out, and I have a 2 left. Do I have a positive 2 left? Yes, I need to remember to put my signs there, right? And I'm done. So I don't know what you think about this because it definitely is a different way to factor, but it's actually something we use in Algebra 2 Trig and in pre-calculus and even calculus we use it. So it's a pretty important tool to have in our toolbox. I know that's kind of an overused analogy, Hopefully that made sense, but we're going to practice in class. And thanks for joining me, and I will see you. Bye.